Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the August 2023 meeting of the Urban Ecology Collaborative. We are a group of groups focused in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. We meet virtually on the third Wednesday of every month, and we talk about urban forestry and related topics. Our Google Groups forum is a great place to share about upcoming events, research, jobs, urban forestry related topics, and it's also where we announce our upcoming meetings and speakers for this meeting. You can see our recent recordings on our YouTube at Urban Ecology Collaborative. And we will get started today by asking if there are any special or community announcements that anybody wanted to raise.
Our new tree equity score is updated, so go check it out. I'll put the link in the chat.
Great, thanks, Becky. That's awesome news.
For these ones that were removed.
Any other special announcements? I know one really cool one that I've had my eye on is the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York. Their cooling report that came out is a really cool resource. I'll try to add that into the chat while we get started here. But thanks for the announcements, and a couple more people have joined, and I will actually hand it over to our new co-chair. Welcome, Clara from Tree Pittsburgh. Yay, we're so excited to have you as a co-chair to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here too. So Dexter Locke is a research geographer from the USDA Forest Service in the Baltimore Field Station. Before joining the communities and landscapes of the Urban Northeast Research Unit, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. He is an urban ecologist with a doctorate from the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University. Conducting applied research with urban natural resource managers is his passion. Yay, we love that, Dexter. If he is not doing urban ecology or programming in R, he is usually to be found rock climbing and hiking throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and listening to classic rock music. So please take it away, Dexter.
Thanks, Clara. Thanks, Erica. Hi, all. Really excited to share today. I was invited to present a little bit about redlining and some of the research involved in that. And do you see my slide? Great, I'm seeing nods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different research projects under this banner of urban forestry, citizen science, and redlining. Interrupt me with quick clarifying questions if you have them, but I'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. And I'm just really grateful to share this work on behalf of my colleagues and co-authors who've helped make this all possible. So thanks for the opportunity. So here's the outline. I'm going to link together 4 studies in chronological order, and I hope that collectively they build a narrative arc about race-based zoning and lending practices and urban ecosystems today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the distribution of tree canopy across 37 cities, dive into an analysis of street trees in Baltimore City, and see how they species and size relates to race-based zoning, lending. And I'm going to talk about some in-progress work on citizen science, bird observations, and give just a little bit of a taste for what I believe is the frontier, some work in progress, looking at multiple taxon. So why are we talking about redlining? Well, there's a number of reasons, but in order to catch your attention on a Wednesday morning, let's start with money. Money should catch your eye. The Chesapeake Bay Trust, and some of you on the line here have been recipients of this funding, is prioritizing community grant, their tree planting program, in part based on this criteria of redlining. So urban, low income, formerly redlined, high unemployment, and public housing are the 5 criteria that are baked into their eligibility rules. And so, and part of that is because of this research, and also it's just to understand that the mechanisms that have led to redline, or the mechanisms behind redlining and the face of the urban ecosystems we see today, trying to redress some of those inequities. So there's money attached to these categories, in part because of the urban forest inequality we'll get to in a moment. So a little bit about redlining. I've been using the term, if you're unfamiliar, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was part of the New Deal, and the idea was to assist struggling Americans at risk of foreclosure. And so the federal government appraised and categorized urban neighborhoods across the US, 239 metropolitan areas in the mid to late 1930s for risk. And they decided A, which was green on the map, was lowest risk, then B, then C, then D. And the D was coded on the maps in red, hence the name redlining. And this appraisal of neighborhoods was in conjunction with local bankers and other parts of the real estate scene. I'll describe more in a moment, that the criteria were in part race-based, but also the quality and age of the housing stock, amenities and disamenities that were present. So the idea was to provide assistance to those at risk of foreclosure, which would further exacerbate the Great Depression. From a research perspective, it has a number of useful characteristics. It was broadly consistent. There's this race-based component. It's spatial. So through the magic of GIS or mapping software, we can link redlining data with a suite of other data sets that are geo-referenced. It was applied at the same time, so I mentioned from the mid to late 1930s, and it was widespread. The 239 largest metropolitan areas were categorized in this way. So from a research perspective, it gives us a number of useful characteristics or traits. But I want to be really clear that race-based housing policy predates redlining, co-occurred with redlining, and can be seen today. This is one snapshot or moment in history that I'm talking about. And so on the right, there's a map of Baltimore, and to give you a sense of what went into this categorization, I'm going to read from one of the assessments. It says, description: an old residential section seriously threatened with Negro encroachments. A small section along Reisterstown Road consists of fairly modern two-story brick rows, that's short for row homes. It goes on to describe the racial composition of the neighborhood, the occupations of the inhabitants. And again, I was quoting from them, their words, not mine. And it says, favorable features, Druid Hill Park and good transportation. Detrimental features, obsolescence and Negro encroachments. Their words, not mine. Druid Hill Park is a park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed many parks relevant to the UEC network, from the Emerald Necklace in Boston, Central Park in New York, and so on. So this gives you a sense of the built environment, the demographic characteristics, the occupations, and other indicators of socioeconomic status that all went into this rating system. A couple of Baltimore-specific numbers. This slide's a little bit outdated. The vacant homes is a little bit lower. The vacant lots is a little bit higher. The black dots on the right show vacant lots are the dots. Vacant lots and vacant buildings are the dots, and you can see the redlining map. So you can see the overwhelming preponderance of correspondence between redlined categories and vacancy today. So this type of home loan and insurance was not offered to some neighborhoods, but was offered to others. And we can see the legacy of that in disinvestment today. So I'm talking about vacancy. I'm going to give a quick plug for a recent paper I'm super proud of. We looked at vacant building removals, so moving the vacant buildings and creating vacant lots. We compared before and after to street segments that had vacant buildings that remained vacant, and we found significant declines in crime, about a 1.4% decline in crime, and in assaults, nearly a 5% decrease, and about a 3% decline in violent crimes. And so this is in correlation. This is really looking before, after quasi-treatment control. And so we have a lot of confidence that the vacant building removals have this knock-on benefit of reducing crime. but we still have a number of vacant lots. So that's a topic for later discussion. So redlining has been associated with a number of social science studies looking at outcomes like poverty and unemployment, educational attainment, various facets of health like diabetes and obesity, and credit scores. And so we see worse outcomes in formerly redlined areas compared to their A counterparts. But what about environmental things? I work for the Forest Service. This is the Urban Ecology Collaborative. So we wanted to look at trees. And we know that tree canopy provides a number of benefits, especially in urban areas, from reducing heat islands, which disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. So the basic logic behind this study was if A-graded areas were single-family homes on larger lots, there would be more space for trees. Another explanation for why we would see more tree canopy today in A versus B than C than D was access to power. And a lot of great work through the Baltimore Ecosystem Study from legal scholars and anthropologists and other allied disciplines have uncovered that the location and allocation of parks and open space very much was tied to those who had the ears of politicians and those with access to power through money and political means. So those are two plausible mechanisms that would explain the pattern we might see today. In either of those cases or other reasons, we would see greater tree canopy in A than B than C than D. So we wrote this paper looking at 37 cities, close to 32 neighborhoods as defined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. We can look at a tree canopy from A to B to C to D. And then in our larger cities, so those to the left of the dotted line on your screen, we could also look at within city variation. So what we found is that formerly A-graded neighborhoods had about 43% tree canopy, and those D-graded counterparts had about half or 22% tree canopy today. It's not only a statistically significant difference, but I encourage you to think about, imagine it's a rainy day and you have 43% of an umbrella. And imagine it's a rainy day and you have 22% of an umbrella. These are meaningful differences that relate to the ecosystem services like heat, stormwater absorption, and many other benefits of trees. So it's a difference beyond the realm of chance, and it's a difference really of meaningful difference. Within the largest cities, we could examine the A to B to C to D, and we see the rank order of redlining corresponds with tree canopy today. And trees don't grow instantaneously, right? So the tree canopy we see today is because of the activities of before. So redlining, even though it was 80 to 90 years ago, is very much relevant for predicting tree canopy today, especially because trees are slow, long-lived organisms. You know, Warren Buffett famously said the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And so we see that lag or that legacy of the policy today. I'll skip through the summary. I feel like I've made this pretty clear already. I'll just mention that we made the data freely available so others can build on that. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention other related work. A couple other studies from different research teams using different data have largely supported the same thing. And I don't view this as a competition. In fact, I see multiple teams, multiple data sets, same conclusion, bolstering a scientific consensus about the legacies of redlining. So one such team used a 30-meter pixel on the left. So while we found about 43% tree canopy, they found about half of that, or about 21% in 2001, 2011. It's also in the 20s. But again, that rank order A, then B, then C, then D. The study on the right also looked at surface temperature, which tracks with impervious surface. So you see on your bottom right. So more impervious surface than D, then C, then B, then A. So surface temperature correlates and tracks with impervious surface, which is the inverse of the relationship we see with tree canopy. Again, the 30-meter pixels misses a lot. So this is Central Park. This is Columbus Circle. high-res imagery. This is the Landsat 30-meter. So does a pretty good job of picking up the canopy in the larger contiguous blocks. But the data that we use with LiDAR is able to see through the shadows, and I'll just toggle back and forth. You can see that the larger blocks are intact, but if we count up all the canopy where people aren't and then correlate it with things about people, we're likely to miss a good chunk of the story. In Philadelphia, the 2008 assessment compared to that Landsat showed it was off by about 50%. So that was tree canopy and redlining in brief. I want to pivot now to a second study talking about street trees. Why street trees? Well, that's a question that many of you could answer better than me. But street trees have a couple of interesting characteristics that I'll focus on. And on the left, you see this. This is like the USDA food pyramid, but for nature exposure. And on the left is a spatial scale, looking from neighborhood, regional, national, or even international. And on the right is a temporal scale or time scale. And you can think about street trees as fitting this bottom rung of again, kind of like the food pyramid. We're talking about the daily neighborhood interactions with greenery in cities, as opposed to a once in a lifetime kind of experience, which you might see on the top. So these very kind of frequent and localized exposures are important for mental health and a growing body of research of health more broadly. But also, usually there's very few actors, very few players within a municipality managing street trees. And so convincing the commissioner of parks that trees are important, or a mayor that street trees are important, is really different from, in the case of New York City, 300 or 750,000 private residential landowners or forest owners. In Baltimore, there's about 250,000 private residential landowners. So that's really a different animal, a different beast from street trees, which tend to have one or a few partners per se. So back to Baltimore, where I've done a lot of my research, looking at redlining, again, and the street tree inventory, thanks to those who've made that available. And thanks to my co-author team at University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins, Forest Service colleagues, and University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So we divided the city into these honeycomb regions, these hexes, to have equal areas so that we'd be comparing apples to apples. As you can see, the neighborhoods vary in size. So we wanted to reduce that source of variability. So we created these hexagonal cells. You can see the trees on the bottom right. And what we did was create these species accumulation curves. And the way these work is, as we march through the data set, let's say we're just looking at an inventory of street trees. And let's say the first is red maple. And in Baltimore, that's a good guess for your first street tree, is red maple. So we've got one individual and we've got one species. And then let's say the next one is, let's say, a red oak. So we now have two individuals, so two on the horizontal and two species on the vertical. And then let's say the next one again is a red maple. So we now have three individuals, but only two species. If we keep marching through the data set, you will accumulate along those curves until, if you keep sampling, you won't uncover new species. You've saturated your sampling. There's no more available species left to find. And this was developed in ecology and landscape ecology, and the mathematics are really well worked out. But what you can see here is that as we parse the city's street tree database by redlining categories, we find higher species richness in A and B compared to C compared to D. And species richness is really important from a resilience perspective. With the changing climate, there's a lot of stressors on street trees and urban forests in general. And having a diverse set of species mitigates some of that, because if we had all one species and something like Dutch elm's disease came along, or Asian longhorn beetle, or emerald ash borer, it could spread from stem to stem to stem unchecked. And so by having a more diverse portfolio of tree species, we hedge our bets against the next urban forest pathogen. So we see greater richness in A than B than C than D, perhaps indicating greater resilience against climate stressors and other urban forest pathogens. Ecologists debate about the best way to do this, if we should look at richness or indices like evenness or diversity indices. And so we did it 3 different ways, and we have substantively the same result, that those A-graded neighborhoods have more species diversity than their D counterparts. We also parsed the tree species by size, an imperfect proxy of age. So trees don't grow instantaneously, like I mentioned. So that's why redlining is perhaps so relevant to look at. So what we see is there's larger diameter street trees in A than B than C than D. That's the box plot on your left. And on the right, you see the smaller stems, less than 5 inches in diameter. Those more likely to be recently planted are more common in C and in D, formerly C and formerly D graded neighborhoods. So I just want to mention a few things. One is, as we've been developing high resolution remote sensing and urban tree canopy assessments, our local partners have been really receptive to this overwhelming finding that higher income areas have more tree canopy, neighborhoods with greater percent white have more tree canopy than their BIPOC counterparts. And so what we've seen is really an adjustment and an adaptive management as a result of that. And so a lot of this planting is in part because of that research showing fewer street trees and lower tree canopy in those formerly C and D neighborhoods. So I would say the finding on the right is very much a response and in part of this adaptive management cycle. And so this wasn't intended to be a gotcha. And the other point I want to mention is that what is the future of the urban forest? What's the distribution of street trees going to look like in the future? And we might have a flip, right? We put the trees in small and they come down large. We have lots of large trees in these A neighborhoods. We can't take those for granted. When they come down, they're going to have a large impact. So what's the future of street trees? It might look different, in part because of these efforts to redress some of these environmental injustices. I want to talk about briefly this really thought-provoking paper by Chris Schell and colleagues. And so on the top right, the idea is, well, if redlining, among other things, affects the distribution of tree canopy in parks and open spaces in cities, which I've just shown with the previous paper, on canopy, we might have a distribution in B, we might have different distributions of species traits of urban mammals or birds and things like that. And then in panel C, we see difference in richness. Do we have more birds and more species of birds? And I was just talking about street trees, and we're starting to nibble away at this idea. Are there different communities and species compositions? That's C. And then D, does that have a scaling effect? Do we have entirely different food webs? So we have more tree canopy in A than B than C than D, and insects live on trees and birds eat those insects. So we have entirely different food webs and ecosystems that are predictable because of this race-based zoning 80 or 90 years ago. So a lot of really thought-provoking research questions and hypotheses that came out of that. Inspired by that, we asked the question, how does sampling density of bird biodiversity vary with historic housing segregation after accounting for environmental and climatic characteristics? So I was approached by this team of Diego and Millie. They're the brains and bronze behind this, the third study in this sequence. Diego's a PhD student at Yale. Millie just finished like last week, submitted the final paperwork at Berkeley, now at NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. They're awesome. They're doing tons of great work in conservation scenarios and planning, species distribution modeling, global scale, looking at movement ecology and big data, Google Earth Engine Wiz, tons of great things to say about them. So if you have any really tough questions, you can direct them to them instead of me. So what we did was we downloaded more than 10 million GBIF observations of birds. GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It's an aggregator of citizen science data. So iNaturalist, museum collections, eBird, breeding bird survey, all kinds of things like that. We aggregated them within close to 10,000 Holk-defined neighborhoods, which was almost 200 cities as defined in the 30s, or 143 census-defined metros today, spanning 38 states. Because we wanted to see how race-based zoning relates to citizen science biodiversity sampling campaigns today. So we're not asking, are the bird communities different? We're asking, is the information about the bird communities different? So where are volunteers going and doing their sampling? This paper was accepted. We've got a preprint. That's this first link. I'll make everything available in addition to the recording. But the soon to come out paper, and the paper and the peer review version, a lot of subsequent analyses were proposed by the reviewers, which we added that did not appear in that preprint. So that the full one has more in there to check out. So what did we find? What we found was the sampling. So the number of volunteer geographic information data points, or points per area, is greater in A than B than C than D. So this is where the bird-based sampling is going.
Yeah.
On the right, we're also using a species accumulation curve, like I mentioned in that previous street tree study. And so we have an estimated completeness. How much of the community do we think we're capturing? And again, we see this statistically significant difference from A to B to C to D. And that's important because a lot of this, like global movement ecology, or if you open up a field guide and they show you a species map of where you're likely to find this bird or plant or insect, a lot of the models that go into drawing those polygons only accept citizen science at a certain level of completeness. So some of these observations in the less sampled areas are likely ignored in those models. And Millie is going to address some of this with subsequent research, but how sensitive are those, how high quality are those maps, and what are the types of biases that are introduced by effectively ignoring those occurrences rather than incorporating them with some kind of a statistical adjustment. We can also parse it. As I mentioned, GBIF is an aggregator of these kinds of data. So we see that the eBird, and if you note the different vertical axes, by far most of the data in this data set are from eBird. iNaturalist does not have such a clear rank order trend, whereas the researchers, the museums and conservatories do have that A to B to C signal that we've seen with the tree canopy studies, the street tree studies, and now with the bird biodiversity studies. We wanted to call this paper, like who wore it better, like when celebrities wear the same outfit, but who's more biased? That did not make it through. So looking at a multivariate model where we're predicting sampling density controlling for NDVI, which is greenness of vegetation, so normalized difference vegetation index, PAD US, that's publicly parks, and it's an open space data set created by USGS. I'm blanking on the acronym, apologies. Great data set of parks and open space across the country. And then population density from census. And what we see is the sampling density is much greater in A than B than C than D. Mostly that's driven by eBird, although that same pattern is apparent in some of the other data sets. And so we were also interested in how this varies over time. I'm a little bit out of sequence. I played with the order of these slides and I made an error. Oh, well. Completeness. So moving from sampling density to completeness, again, we see that same pattern, A to B to C to D. And again, that completeness is really important because what are we going to do with the data next? So volunteers uploaded all these data, but what kind of analyses do they go into next? And most of the time, only data of a certain completeness threshold are passed on to species distribution models or analyzed for other things. So a lot of the data, even though that bird was observed in, let's say, a formerly degraded neighborhood, it's not being carried forward to subsequent analysis. How is it changing over time? We can think about like a digital divide. And the trend shows that not only is there a gap in the sampling, which I've been harping on for the last little bit, but actually that's growing, and it got 40% larger in 20 years. So that difference in sampling seems to be getting more biased over time. We can make a prediction for each of the 195 cities. I'm just showing Baltimore here. But we have those data if anyone's interested. I'm more than happy to share. So what's next? We looked at birds, we looked at density, we looked at completeness, we looked at trends over time. But what we wanted to understand is, are the birders different from other types of citizen science, other taxa, reptiles, amphibians, looking at plants, for example. So we downloaded more GBIF data, this time 3.3 million observations among the redline polygons. We wanted to include the broader encompassing urban areas, to include not just the previously redlined areas, but the urban area that they exist in. So this is a proxy for areas that weren't residential in the 1930s. So they're younger in their developmental trajectory, or they had different land uses back then. And then in the broader still, MSA's metropolitan statistical area, so the much larger encompassing urban-rural continuum. So we downloaded like 24 million observations, and that's not so straightforward. I'd be happy to talk about how we did that with a number of techniques. A little bit more about the urban area versus metropolitan statistical area. So the MSA is this larger gray box, and the urban area is the purple one here. Zooming in on part of Ohio, you get a sense like Columbus versus the Columbus MSA. The urban area definition is about population density. The MSA has a contiguity criteria from the census, so that they're slightly different. Anyways, two ways of looking at that. And just for those who are familiar with the Baltimore Metro, this will maybe make a little bit more sense, but they don't exactly line up because they have some different criteria. So what do we find? This is totally back of the envelope, first cut, raw analyses. I want you to note the different vertical axes here. So with birds, this is what we've seen before, A, then B, then C, then D. This is basically on a log scale. And then the urban area, this is rough, so MSA should be further right. And so we see that same trend, but that's not true for amphibians or mammals or plants, maybe for reptiles. And then I'll just mention, so with insects and fungus, it's really hard to identify down to a species level, even for experts. So instead of looking at species, we also looked at the family level. So we did it both ways. It took a ton of work. Why do one project when you can do 9 projects simultaneously? And it took a bunch of time to do that, and did not make a difference whatsoever, but it's a good thing that we checked that. Here we are looking at completeness. So bird sampling is almost 100% complete on average. That even if we send more volunteers to look at more birds, we're probably not going to uncover more species. There are so many people in these data sets that have complete bird checklists that are out there at all times of day. Erica's nodding her head at Massa Audubon. But that's not really representative of those looking at mammals or plants. In fact, with plants, we see the opposite trend. We're seeing actually more complete in D than in A. More interpretations to be made there. Of course, this is very rough. And then finally, richness. So getting to panel C and Chris Shell, like, do we actually have different species composition, in this case, richness of these different taxon? And of course, the urban area and metro are higher. This is a nice double check that there was no programming error, because these are the broader areas that are getting into suburban and exurban, and now including state parks and things like that. So yes, species richness is greater out there. So I've talked about sampling density and predicted completeness. Where I think we want to go next is functional diversity and community composition. I think that's really the frontier. So in the beginning of the talk, I talked about my own tree canopy research and colleagues' tree canopy research. We do see a difference from A to B to C to D, whether it's point-based sampling from one study I didn't mention, or high resolution data, is coarse resolution data. Yeah, we're seeing this. This is pretty well worked out. We have a high level of scientific consensus on that. I've been talking about C, trying to get at that with street trees, the bird study. We're starting to get a little bit more at that with this multi-taxon work of species composition, more work to be done there. And then really the frontier is going to be this functional diversity and entire food webs. I don't think we'll get there for food webs with GBIF because we need this sampling to be co-located. And that just doesn't happen with volunteer data, but it's going to help us make inferences about community composition and similarities between different communities. So I've presented here 4 studies, 3 that are wrapped up, 1 that's on progress, 1 looking at tree canopy and redlining. Again, trees are slow growing organisms. By looking at the policies 80 years ago, we can see that the legacy of some of those race-based policies on the distribution of tree canopy today. We dove into Baltimore to look a little bit more about street trees and species diversity, because we know about resilience from species diversity and the future of the urban forest and pests and resistance to that and so on. And then looking at not just, if trees are sort of the base of the food web, insects live on trees, birds eat the insects, but if the whole food web sort of starts with urban vegetation and trees, then we would expect this cascading kind of impacts on all different types of creatures. And so we started to look at that, first looking at the biases of the citizen science data, and now starting to look at the differences in the community. So I hope that was interesting, maybe useful. Feel free to get in touch, and I'll stop for questions. Thanks for the opportunity to share. I really appreciate it, Clara and Erica, for the invitation.
Thank you, Dexter, for that presentation. I was taking lots of notes, and I'm sure folks have some questions. There was a discussion happening between Neha and Morgan in the chat about the difference in the trend in the data that you're seeing in the iNaturalist versus the other platforms. I don't know if y'all want to bring it to this table, everybody in the chat, or if you want to say anything about that, Dexter, I could read the questions.
Yeah, just skimming really quickly. It seems like the question is like, well, who's doing the work? Who's doing the sampling? We don't have that in these GBIF data. Deja Perkins, North Carolina State, their dissertation, phenomenal, looking at bird sampling in 2 hot, dry places, 2 cooler, wetter places, and looking at who's actually doing the birding. Spoiler alert, it's mostly old white men. So even if the data are in a formerly C or D graded neighborhood, the people who are doing it, there's a mismatch between this area-based data of the, who lives in the neighborhood versus who's doing the sampling in the neighborhood. So Deja has done some of the most cutting-edge work in that. I'll just put the name in the chat. But there's a lot of questions on that. I don't know if there's a follow-up question or anything like that. But
that was great insight. Neha, do you want to say anything? I see you about to unmute.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Thanks so much, Dexter, for this, and thanks for putting it on. Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is a follow-up, and it makes me think about, in terms of Deja's work, and maybe this is more of a question for Deja, but I'm thinking also about like formerly D-rated neighborhoods and gentrification and how things shift as well. And yeah, but I don't think it's a fully formed question. It's more of just a thought. But I have a second question that I'll ask, and you can answer however you'd like. So I focus on wildlife in New York City, and my specialty is amphibians and reptiles. And I know that amphibian presence is often associated with like wetlands and land use, as opposed to something like trees, which of course birds are a little bit more associated with. I'm curious how you guys are thinking about those kinds of variables in your modeling, especially as you compare across taxa.
I'll take the second question first. So the multi-taxa work, we're working out the covariates now. So like the greenness, population density, and parks and open space we used for birds probably are sufficient. Not going to cut it for the amphibians and reptiles for exactly the reasons you mentioned. Wetlands and the habitat requirements of those other taxon are more specific. So we need to condition on those kinds of things. So that was the second question first. And the first question was, green gentrification and A and B and C and D. So yeah, redlining does predict tree canopy really well, as I've mentioned. But those A, B, C, D grades are not path dependent. It does not, it's not a foregone conclusion of what those neighborhoods are today. So like in Baltimore, Canton was redlined, and it's now the highest income neighborhood in Baltimore City. I did some analysis. We were never able to get it published, but we were able to show like the redlining grades and then the housing market today. And many of them do correspond where they were economically depressed and they're still economically depressed. Some of them have gentrified. Some of them were some of the hottest neighborhoods to be in and now are no longer. And so it's not a, I'm struggling for the right term, but there's not a lock-in, right? Like I showed with Seattle, there's actually two neighborhoods that have the most tree canopy in Seattle today were formerly degraded neighborhoods. There are exceptions. There are many different factors at play. The world is more complicated than tree canopy and the colors on a red line map. And so the causal factors, of course, it's a multi-causal world. And so, I'll end there for other questions. Thanks for that. Both of those questions, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I see Morgan has her hand raised. Morgan, go ahead.
Yeah, so two questions. You can of course answer them in whatever order you want. With the bird reporting data, if one thinks about that as being associated with outreach programs, and you've done research on outreach programs for tree planting, it seems to me that it may be worthwhile to look at. My question, is it worthwhile to look at the different outreach programs, engagement programs that you may have, and actually making some comparisons between, learning in the outreach for citizen science, like iNaturalist, and tree planting programs? That's one question. The second is, rather than relying only on redlining, if we change the framing to how has historic and current racially based housing segregation affected tree canopy, because it's existed for a long time and it probably still exists today.
Yeah.
Versus just poking at redlining. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that too.
Yeah. So the distribution of tree canopy today and who lives there is really well worked out. As you know, Morgan invented a lot of these techniques. So one of the most clear and consistent findings is higher income neighborhoods have more tree canopy today than their lower income counterparts. Communities of color tend to have less tree canopy than their predominantly white counterparts. So we've known that, and we continue to see that. Many different cities, many different data sets. And there's a couple of great meta-analyses by Watkins and Garish and Watkins that look at that. And so we added the redlining piece because trees don't grow instantaneously. And so we know about that distribution today, and that's what made us curious about yesterday. On the social networks component, just like my own personal experience, like I volunteered at the Bee Lab in Patuxent, USGS, and Fish and Wildlife. They do a bunch of research on which pollinator species of plants different bees like. And the bee people are not the same people per se as who goes to Tree Baltimore's annual meeting or the winter gathering. And I've never been to a bird thing. And the forest stewards from Baltimore Green Space, they're starting to go to different forests. I do think there are some people that are sort of cross pollinators, but there is a bit of a siloing. And I think STUMAP, the Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project from the Forest Service, and many, many other collaborators in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, we've done a few times now, Seattle and other cities, lets us catalog the types of groups, where they're working, and their networks. So we can start to say, are the green infrastructure advocates more tightly networked than, for example, the tree stewardship communities? Are the animal rights advocates, is there one big hub and a bunch of spokes, or is it lots and lots of hubs? And how does that network structure differ? It's not just like sciencey and fun and cool. I think the practical application is, well, if the birders are well piped in with each other and they don't know about the rain barrels and green infrastructure, that's an opportunity for those listservs and in-person gatherings to meet. And similarly, if the bee people don't know about Tree Baltimore's annual meeting, that's an opportunity for the pollinator folks to connect with the street tree advocates. And so I hope I answered that question, Morgan, which was maybe one part question and one part prompt for us to talk about STUMAP, which I always love to do.
Fred.
Hey, Dexter. I'm going to ask about street trees again. So I was thinking, and I have, for those who don't know, Dexter and I, we've been talking about the street tree study for a while, but it came to my mind about average size of trees in these studies and historically redline is to whether you were, it's just a throw out there, whether you're incorporating space volume, the space or area of the trees involved, and whether this had a correlation to the size of the trees in those neighborhoods, because we know that a lot of those historically redlined districts are in the very dense urban areas where there are smaller pits, which are going to lead to shorter life expectancies for those trees, and whether there was any correlation for that. And I know that we have that data about the size of the spaces involved in that. We were just throwing it out there. I thought about that when I was talking today, whether that's a case for that in those neighborhoods. I don't know. I'm throwing that out there. And of course, Dexter mentioned our Tree Baltimore gathering. So we have our summer gathering next week for those not in attendance. If you're in Baltimore, come out on Wednesday night to Silburn.
It's next Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. I have it on my calendar. Thanks. So based on some of the feedback we got from that study, we were so interested to answer questions like the ones Fred mentioned and many more. We hired a very capable undergrad at Johns Hopkins, and we're combing through those data now. Trini has been doing some great analysis, along with Megan Avolio and others. And the one thing on population density, yeah, like, density in general, a lot of those formerly redline neighborhoods are in the urban core, downtown, or, next level of density out. And it's really tough to get a street tree in some of those. And the trees that are there have shorter lifespans. And so I want to incorporate more about the pit size, which is a part of that data set, which is great. So just to say, we've been thinking about that. We're working on that. More will be revealed. Maybe in 6 or 8 months, I can give a brief update. But as always, it's more complicated. And we've been trying to work that in. So
I have I have 2 questions myself, and I don't know if it's valid for me to ask, but I do want to ask. The first question is around your work was on street trees, and I was curious if you're looking at even just naturally forested areas that are not necessarily street trees when you're looking at the comparison of species densities in the neighborhoods versus, for the redline neighborhoods. So I was just curious what it would look like if you incorporated like just naturally forested areas or parks. So was there a specific reason you were looking at street trees versus things like that could affect diversity?
Yeah, it's a great question. For the street tree analysis, we were just looking at street trees, in part because it's a part of the urban forest a lot of people have contact with. Like I mentioned, there's like neighborhood scale, very local, daily kind of interactions. And also because the number of actors is relatively few. And then on the data side, we have this great data set. So that's why we look at street trees for that. In terms of comparing to other areas, I was part of a different paper that looked at street trees and I just put a link in the chat, and that actually looks at, we had a stratified random sample by land use for these permanent urban forestry plots, and there's about 200 of them, and some of them are in backyards, some include street trees, some of them are on golf courses and parks and things like that. And then we matched up the ones where we had the street trees and the inventories from those plots, and we could look at the things that are in common versus the things that are unique. So thanks for that question, Clara, because we do have a study that did look at all these other land uses and how they compare to street trees. We didn't specifically look at redlining. We don't have exactly the answer to that question, but we do look at present day demographics and how the street trees differ from the species of trees found in those other types of land uses, and how those in turn co-vary with neighborhood demographics.
Thank you. I do have another question, but I'll let Julian ask before. If it's time for my second question, I'll ask it.
Hey everyone, thank you Dexter for that super interesting presentation. One thing that we see quite often in New York is these like very tense correspondences and conflicts in certain neighborhoods in terms of street tree planting. So I'm curious if you're documenting any like negative reactions to street tree planting in certain neighborhoods, and if so, how, and how you're sort of like navigating the situations.
Yeah, I love it.
Love some advice.
Sort of an age-old. So I used to work in New York City. I'm familiar with some of the dynamics there. And what I love about the UEC is that roughly half of the cities, DC, Baltimore, Philly, New York, New Haven, Worcester, Boston, about half of them say this is public infrastructure. You don't get a say where we put the bus stop. You don't get a say where we put the fire hydrant. We're planting every available street tree opportunity possible because it's city land. And the other half say, well, we have a list of people who want a street tree that's this long, and the number of people we can get to is only this long this season. So why are we planting trees where people don't want them? And the UEC is just great because we have these different approaches, right? And I don't know which one is right, if there even is a right. But I know that a lot of people don't want street trees, and there are several papers. I'll try to find some right now that are people pushing back on street trees, and they don't want them, and they're sabotaged, and they're replaced, and they're sabotaged, and they're replaced over and over again. What is common, it seems, is that people feeling heard and people having their concerns listened to and being part of the process is incredibly advantageous. I don't know if other actual, folks that do street tree planting want to chime in. I see Erica Smith, Fitchman in Philly, Mish, and all these different approaches in different cities. And pushback against street trees is real. And there is some research on that. And maybe while I punt on that, I can find a couple of citations for you.
This is giving me a really maybe interesting idea for UEC for September. We have 2 minutes left, Claire. I want to make sure you get your question in, but maybe we do a roundtable on urban tree disservices is how I've heard it phrased by like Christine Carmichael's work, or like maybe we talk about this at the next meeting in a roundtable type format and hear from, people's different experiences. But go ahead, Clara, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I love this discussion. We could be here for another hour. Now, my second question was around the species diversity, like in the, well, I don't want to call them, okay, in those communities that were redlined, because I've realized that a lot of these communities may have urban farms and gardens that may be affecting the types of species. Because I know we say, trees live on trees and then birds eat the insects and then that's that diverse. So I wonder if that research is combining things like urban gardens and how that's affecting species diversity in terms of animals and creatures that live in these different neighborhoods. I don't know if it should make sense, Dexter, but it's in relation, I think, to one of the other studies that you had brought up.
Yeah. Even just the plants are more complicated than just trees, right? Pollinator gardens and wetland adjacent species, and there's a lot going on in cities. It's not just Times Square in Manhattan, right? There are living things in built places that we all know about, but it is easy to oversimplify at times. So it's complex. We're trying to break off chunks that we can at a time, and I hope that it will build to something greater than the sum of the pieces.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we hit 11 o'clock right on the dot. Thank you so much, Dexter, and thank you everyone for joining. Our next meeting will be in September. I think it's September 20th. We have also been thinking about the World Forum on Urban Forests in October. Claire and I are both going to be there, so hopefully we'll see some folks in DC, and we'll also see you in September, maybe to talk about tree disservices. Thank you so much, Dexter. We always appreciate hearing from you, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks so much. I hope this was useful.
Take care.